The fall of the tyrant HOA, a neighborhood's fight for freedom. Have you ever encountered a homeowners association, HOA, so obsessed with control that they'd rather block legal construction than let a homeowner win? Well, they picked the wrong fight because my uncle happens to be the mayor. Michael Carter had lived in his quiet suburban neighborhood for 5 years. He was a straightforward guy, hardworking, law-abiding, and not the type to stir up trouble. After years of saving, he finally had the chance to expand his home. His plan was simple: build a small guest house in his backyard for his aging parents, who wanted to live closer to family. Everything was above board. Permits were filed, approvals were granted, and local zoning laws were fully on his side. But then came the HOA. The Homeowners Association, led by the infamous Diane Harper, was notorious for its absurd rules and selective enforcement. Diane, the self-appointed queen of the neighborhood, ran the HOA like her personal fiefdom. She had a loyal enforcer, Greg Simmons, who ensured her rules were followed, or else. At first, Michael thought the process would be straightforward. He submitted his plans, confident that the HOA had no legitimate grounds to reject him. But then the games began. The HOA refused to process his permit. First, they claimed they had lost his paperwork. When he resubmitted, they cited a processing delay. Weeks passed, and then they hit him with the excuse that his guest house would violate community aesthetics. This was nonsense. Several of his neighbors had backyard structures of their own. When Michael pointed this out, Diane smirked and said, "HOA rules change when necessary." Michael wasn't naive. He saw what was happening. The HOA wasn't about fairness, it was about control. They didn't like him standing up to them, and now they wanted to make an example out of him. Fine. If they wanted to play games, he'd play to win. He hired a lawyer specializing in HOA disputes. The lawyer reviewed the case and confirmed what Michael already knew. The HOA had no legal basis to deny his permit. They were just stalling. Armed with this information, Michael confronted the board at the next HOA meeting. He presented his case, citing local laws and precedents. But Diane barely glanced at his paperwork. "This isn't about legality, Michael," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "This is about what's best for the community." Michael clenched his jaw. "So, you're just going to ignore the law?" Diane smiled. "You're welcome to take it up with the HOA Review Committee." Michael already knew what that meant. The Review Committee was just a group of Diane's closest allies, all of whom would rubber stamp whatever she wanted. It was a dead end. But Michael had one thing they weren't expecting: persistence. That night, he dug deeper into the HOA's rules and financial records. What he found was shocking. The HOA had been selectively enforcing rules for years, granting exceptions to those who played nice with Diane while hammering anyone who pushed back. Even worse, he found evidence that some board members had approved their own renovations while denying similar requests from others. Michael knew what he had to do. If they wanted to make this a battle, he'd take it all the way. The next day, he sent a formal letter to the HOA demanding they process his permit or face legal action. In response, they did something even more outrageous. They accused him of making unauthorized modifications to his home. They issued him a violation notice, claiming that parts of his property didn't conform to HOA standards. It was a blatant lie, and Michael knew it. Then came the fines. First, it was a 100 penalty for a fence violation. His fence had been tisamising kamovden. Then another 100 penalty for a fence violation. His fence had been tisamising kamovden. Then another 250 for landscaping noncompliance. His lawn was immaculate. The fines kept piling up, each more absurd than the last. They were trying to bury him in bureaucracy, hoping he'd give up. But Michael wasn't backing down. One night, as he sat at his desk reviewing his next steps, his phone buzzed. It was his uncle, Richard Carter, the mayor of their city. He had heard about the HOA's antics and wanted to know what was going on. Michael explained everything, from the delays to the fines to the blatant corruption. His uncle listened carefully, then said something that made Michael sit up straight. "I'll handle it personally." Michael exhaled. Maybe, just maybe, this battle wasn't as one-sided as the HOA thought. The HOA strikes back. With his uncle, Mayor Richard Carter, now involved, Michael felt a surge of confidence. But he knew better than to celebrate too soon. The HOA was desperate to maintain control, and people like Diane didn't take kindly to being challenged. The first sign that things were escalating came the next morning. Michael received another letter from the HOA, this time stating that his construction project had been officially denied due to zoning violations. It was a complete fabrication. His lawyer had already confirmed that everything was in compliance. But when he called the city office to verify, he was met with an even more shocking revelation. Mr. Carter, according to our records, your permit application was never submitted, the clerk said hesitantly. Michael gripped his phone tightly. That's impossible. I have confirmation emails. I have receipts. I understand, sir, but according to our system, there's no record of it. Michael hung up and stared at the screen in disbelief. The HOA had done more than just block his permit. They had somehow erased it from the city's database. It was a move straight out of a political thriller. He immediately called his lawyer, who was equally stunned. This is blatant fraud, the lawyer said. They're falsifying records. We need to escalate this. That's when Michael realized the HOA wasn't just stalling him. They were trying to bury his case so deep that by the time he untangled the mess, it would be too late. But they had underestimated him. He took the problem straight to his uncle, who wasted no time making calls. Within hours, the mayor's office confirmed that Michael's permit had, in fact, been submitted weeks ago. Someone had manually removed it from the city's system. The moment that news broke, the HOA scrambled to cover their tracks. Then the fines started rolling in at an even more absurd rate. First, he got a citation for unauthorized lawn furniture because his backyard had a patio set. Then a noise violation for playing music at normal volume levels. His favorite was the improperly positioned garbage bin's fine, $1.75, because his trash can was an inch outside the designated space. Michael wasn't just fighting for his permit anymore. He was in a war of attrition. The neighborhood rises. The real gut punch came when Michael spoke to his best friend and next-door neighbor, Alex. Look, man, Alex said, avoiding eye contact. I've got to back off from this whole HOA thing. Michael frowned. Back off? You were with me from the start. Yeah, but, Alex sighed. Diane came by last night. She said if I keep supporting you, they'll start looking into my house. I can't afford that, man. I've got a family. Michael clenched his jaw. Diane was now using fear to isolate him. But not everyone caved. Mrs. Henderson, the elderly woman who lived 2 doors down, knocked on his door that evening. Michael, dear, she said, handing him a folder. I've lived here for 20 years, and I've seen this HOA do some terrible things. But this is the worst. I thought you might find this useful. Inside the folder were old HOA meeting minutes, emails, and financial statements. At first, it seemed like standard bureaucracy. Then he saw it. Hidden among the documents was evidence that the HOA had been selectively approving projects for years, often in exchange for donations. Diane and her inner circle had personally benefited from these so-called exceptions. Michael had the smoking gun. That night, he compiled everything into a formal complaint and sent it directly to the mayor's office. But he wasn't stopping there. He leaked key details to a local journalist, someone who had a history of exposing corruption. The final showdown. The next morning, Michael woke up to find something new waiting for him. His car had been vandalized, the windows were shattered, and someone had spray-painted Community Trader across the side. He checked his security cameras, expecting to see random vandals. Instead, what he found made his blood boil. It was Greg Simmons, the HOA enforcer. Michael immediately called the police, but before they could even respond, Diane sent him an email. Maybe this is a sign that you should stop fighting and just accept what's best for the neighborhood. We wouldn't want things to get worse, would we? That was it. This wasn't just about bureaucracy anymore. They were actively trying to intimidate him. Michael forwarded the email to his uncle. Within hours, Mayor Carter had issued an official investigation into the HOA. City inspectors were ordered to audit all recent permit denials, and the local news ran a story about HOA corruption. The HOA board members panicked. Diane and Greg stopped responding to emails. Several of the lesser board members suddenly resigned for personal reasons. But Michael knew they weren't going to give up that easily. They still had one last move left. A week later, Michael received a certified letter from the HOA. He opened it, half expecting another ridiculous fine. Instead, it was something much worse. The HOA was attempting to foreclose on his house. They claimed he owed over $10,000 in unpaid fines, a number they had fabricated out of thin air. It was an all-or-nothing move. They knew the city was closing in on them, so they were trying to destroy him before they fell. Michael wasn't sure how this would end, but one thing was certain: Diane had just made the biggest mistake of her life. Justice served. With the HOA's finances frozen and the city's investigation in full swing, the neighborhood finally began to heal. Michael resumed construction on his guest house, and the community came together to celebrate their newfound freedom. Diane Harper and Greg Simmons were arrested and charged with fraud, embezzlement, and harassment. The HOA was officially dissolved, and homeowners who had been victimized by their corrupt practices received full refunds for all the bogus fines they had paid. Michael's guest house was completed, and he hosted a massive barbecue to celebrate. At the center of the party, he unveiled a plaque that read, "This structure was made possible despite the worst HOA in history. May it stand as a reminder to never let petty tyrants control your home." The crowd erupted in cheers. Michael raised his glass in a toast. "To freedom," he said. The entire neighborhood echoed the words back. And just like that, the reign of the HOA was officially over. Epilogue: a new beginning. With the HOA gone, the neighborhood transformed almost overnight. The tension that had ruled the community for years disappeared, replaced by a sense of freedom and unity. People finally felt like their homes were truly theirs. Michael's story became a rallying cry for homeowners everywhere. It was a reminder that no matter how powerful an HOA might seem, they could be held accountable. The corrupt HOA had tried to play dirty, but in the end, Michael had played smarter. As for Diane Harper, she was sentenced to 6 years in prison. Her assets were seized to pay back the homeowners she had defrauded. Even her own home was foreclosed on, a poetic end to her reign of tyranny. Michael, meanwhile, finally had peace. His guest house was finished, his neighbors were happy, and best of all, he didn't have to live under the HOA's oppressive rules anymore. One evening, as he sat on his porch watching the sunset, his uncle, Mayor Richard Carter, pulled up in his car. "Looks like everything turned out the way it should," the mayor said, sitting down next to Michael. Michael nodded. "It did." The mayor smirked. "So what's next for you? You going to run for HOA president?" Michael laughed. "No way. I've had enough of HOAs to last a lifetime." The mayor chuckled. "Fair enough. But if you ever change your mind, let me know. I think this town could use a guy like you keeping people honest." Michael took a deep breath, looking around at his peaceful, HOA-free neighborhood. "Honestly," he said with a grin, "I think I'm just going to enjoy my victory for a while." And with that, the reign of the HOA was officially over. The neighborhood was free, and Michael had won not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been bullied by a power-hungry HOA. This rewritten version maintains the original story's core elements while expanding on details and character interactions to meet the word count. The names have been changed, and the narrative has been enhanced to make it more engaging and immersive. 12.txt. TXT 26.51 kilobytes. Hey Viet Lai Cho Twa Content Nai, Jiningwin Y, Noi Dung, Boi Can, Kot Truyen, Chinzak 150,000 to 200,000 2, Thay Doi Tin Nan Vat Trong Kot Chuzen. Luan Viet Bang Tiang on Chuan My MOT Catch Tu Nien, Dung Ku Fap, Viet Hap Dan Thursday Hut Nuoi Ne, Hey Viet Ca Fan Ket Kotrian. The Fall of the Tyrant HOA President, a Neighborhood's Triumph. 911. What's your emergency? The dispatcher's voice was calm, professional, and prepared for the worst. This is an emergency. There's a criminal in our neighborhood. The woman's voice was shrill, breathless, as if she had just witnessed a robbery in progress. What's happening, ma'am? A delinquent is trespassing and causing destruction. He's got some kind of dangerous weapon. He's attacking private property. She gasped dramatically. The dispatcher's fingers hovered over the keyboard. Weapon? Attack? This sounded serious. Can you describe the suspect? He's on some kind of rolling device, moving fast, doing aggressive maneuvers. The dispatcher frowned. Rolling device? Ma'am, are you saying he's on a skateboard? Yes, that's what I said. A dangerous skateboard. The dispatcher exhaled slowly, rubbing her temples. This wasn't the first time she had taken a ridiculous call from an HOA neighborhood. But the woman on the phone was already screaming for urgent police backup. She had no choice but to send officers. The skateboarder who started it all. Liam had no idea he was about to be the subject of a 911 emergency call. He was just enjoying the afternoon, gliding across the smooth pavement of his own driveway, perfecting a kickflip. The air was crisp, and for once, there was no homework looming over him. Then the screech came. "You? Stop right there." Liam sighed. He didn't even have to turn his head to know who it was. Margaret. Every HOA had one. That one neighbor who had nothing better to do than make everyone's life miserable. The self-appointed lawmaker, judge, jury, and executioner of all things neighborhood peace. And here she was, stomping down the sidewalk, her arms crossed, her nose upturned as if she had just smelled something offensive. "Are you seriously skateboarding?" Margaret demanded. Liam exhaled through his nose. "I'm in my own driveway, Margaret. I am the president of this HOA, young man, and I know for a fact that skateboarding is illegal here." Liam raised an eyebrow. "Illegal skateboarding? That's not a rule," he said flatly. Margaret's lips tightened. "It should be," she huffed. "Do you have any idea how dangerous that thing is? You could be damaging property. What if you hit a car? What if you scratch the pavement? What if you crash into a pedestrian?" "Margaret, I'm literally just doing a kickflip," Liam said, demonstrating it in the next second, smoothly flipping the board under his feet. Margaret shrieked. "You see that? That was an aggressive maneuver." Liam blinked. "What?" Before he could even respond, Margaret was already pulling out her phone. "I'm calling the police," she declared. Liam stared at her. "You're calling 911 because I'm skateboarding?" "Because you're being a nuisance," she snapped. "And you're endangering the neighborhood." Liam groaned, running a hand down his face. He had lived in this neighborhood long enough to know that arguing with Margaret was like arguing with a brick wall. Except the brick wall had a really loud voice and called itself the queen of the HOA. So he did the only logical thing. He skated away. "Oh no, you don't. Come back here, you little criminal." Liam kept skating, casually rolling down the sidewalk, ignoring Margaret's furious screams behind him. She was still talking to 911, waving her arms around like she was directing traffic. The police arrived. A few minutes later, Liam turned into his own home, where his dad, Mark, was watering the lawn, blissfully unaware of the impending disaster. "Hey, Dad." "Hey, Sport. How was the session?" "Margaret just called the cops on me." Mark paused. "What?" Liam shrugged. "Yeah. She started screaming that skateboarding was illegal and that I was a danger to society." Mark closed his eyes. Not again. This wasn't the first time Margaret had thrown a fit over something petty. Last month, she tried to fine the neighbors for having the wrong shade of blue on their trash bins. Before that, she lost her mind over a parked car being half an inch over the driveway line. And now, apparently, skateboarding was a felony. "You sure she actually called the police?" Mark asked. "Oh yeah," Liam said. "She was yelling into the phone like I was committing grand theft auto." Mark sighed, shutting off the hose. "All right, let's go see how this circus plays out." They didn't have to wait long. Less than 5 minutes later, 2 police cars rolled up, lights flashing. Margaret stood triumphantly in the middle of the street, pointing at Liam like he was a wanted fugitive. "There he is. Arrest him." The officers stepped out, hands on their belts, scanning the area. They looked at Margaret, then at Liam standing there with his skateboard under his arm. One officer, a tall guy with a mustache, frowned. "Wait, ma'am, are you saying the emergency is a kid skateboarding?" Margaret gasped, as if personally insulted. "Not just skateboarding. He's been terrorizing the neighborhood with that thing. It's dangerous. It's against HOA policy." The officer glanced at Mark. "Sir, is that true?" "Nope," Mark said. "She just doesn't like my son and makes up rules to control people." Margaret scoffed. "Oh, you're just going to take his word for it?" The officer sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Ma'am, you do realize that calling 911 over a non-crime is considered abuse of emergency services, right?" Margaret's face twitched. This was an emergency. "An emergency is someone breaking into a house," the officer said dryly. "Not a teenager doing skateboard tricks in his own driveway." Margaret's jaw dropped. "Are you saying you're not going to arrest him?" The officers exchanged looks. The mustached one turned back to Mark and Liam. "We're really sorry for the inconvenience, sir. You and your son have a great day." Margaret's face turned beet red. "No. You're supposed to uphold HOA rules." "We uphold the law, ma'am," the officer said. "Not imaginary neighborhood laws you made up." At that moment, Mark thought the situation couldn't get any funnier. He was wrong. Because the officer's partner suddenly looked at Liam again, frowning. Wait a minute. Carter. Your last name is Carter. Liam nodded. The officer's eyebrows raised. Your uncle wouldn't happen to be Judge Carter, would he? Liam smirked. Yeah. What? Margaret's entire body went still. And just like that, the game had changed. Margaret's downfall. The moment the officer mentioned Judge Carter, Mark saw the exact second Margaret realized she had made a catastrophic mistake. Her smug expression flickered, a quick dart of her eyes, a gulp so loud Mark almost heard it. But of course, she wasn't about to admit she had just called the cops on the nephew of a highly respected judge. Margaret's brain did what it did best, scrambled for a way to spin the situation. Judge Carter? Oh, what a coincidence, she chirped, her voice suddenly sugar-sweet. Such a fine, upstanding man. Of course, I wasn't implying that his nephew was a criminal, just a little misguided. Liam raised an eyebrow. Misguided? Yes. Margaret clapped her hands together, forcing a laugh. You know, kids, they can be so rowdy. And I was just. Ma'am, the officer interrupted, not buying a single word. 5 minutes ago, you called 911 screaming that this young man was attacking private property with a dangerous rolling device. Margaret flinched. Well, that might have been a slight exaggeration. The mustached officer, Officer Reynolds, exhaled through his nose, visibly annoyed. Let me get this straight, ma'am, he said, crossing his arms. You called an emergency line, wasting police resources because you personally don't like skateboarding. Margaret gasped in fake outrage. That is not what I did. I called because he was violating HOA rules. This is a crime. Officer Reynolds pulled out his notepad and flipped a few pages. I checked the HOA bylaws before coming here, he said. There's no rule against skateboarding. Margaret's entire body tensed. Well, there should be. It's a dangerous activity. It could cause damage. What if? Ma'am, the officer cut in, his voice firm now. That's not how laws work. You don't just make them up when you feel like it. The second officer, a younger guy named Officer Davies, turned back to Liam. Son, did you do anything besides skateboard? Liam shrugged. Nope. Just skating in my own driveway. Not bothering anyone. Just practicing. Did you damage anything? Hit a car? Endanger anyone? Nope. Davies turned to Officer Reynolds and nodded. Sounds like a false report to me. Margaret's face drained of all color. False. False report? This is not a false report. Reynolds clicked his pen and started writing. Ma'am, I'm issuing you a formal warning for misuse of emergency services. If you do this again, you could be facing a fine or legal action. Margaret sputtered. You're punishing me? What about him? She jabbed a finger at Liam. He still needs to be dealt with. His uncle being a judge doesn't mean he gets to do whatever he wants. Officer Reynolds sighed heavily. Ma'am, he was skateboarding on his own property. That is not a crime. Margaret sniffed loudly, realizing she had no allies here. She turned toward Mark, her last desperate attempt to assert dominance. Well, what do you have to say about all this? She demanded. Mark smiled. I think this is hilarious. Margaret's eye twitched. This is not funny, she snapped. Oh, it's hilarious, Mark corrected. You really thought you could call the cops on a teenager for doing kickflips, and now you're standing here getting written up while the whole neighborhood watches. Margaret's jaw clenched as she suddenly realized they had an audience. Several neighbors had come outside, some pretending to water their lawns, others very openly recording on their phones. HOA Karen at it again, someone muttered. Is this for the Facebook group? Another neighbor whispered, nudging his wife. Oh, you know it's going up. Margaret's hands balled into fists, and Mark could practically see the steam coming out of her ears. This is a conspiracy, she shrieked. You're all against me. I am the HOA president. I am the law here. Officer Reynolds stared at her, unimpressed. No, ma'am, he said. The law is the actual law, not whatever you decide it is. Then, as if to seal the deal, his radio crackled. Unit 17, update on that call. Reynolds pressed the button. False alarm. Just an overzealous HOA president calling in a personal grievance. We're wrapping up here. Margaret let out a strangled noise, like a dying tea kettle. But Mark wasn't done. Hey, Liam, he said loudly enough for the neighbors to hear. Why don't you show the officers that trick you were working on? Liam grinned, stepping onto his skateboard. With one smooth motion, he rolled back, gained momentum, and landed a perfect kickflip right in front of Margaret and the cops. The neighbors cheered. Even Officer Davies smirked. Not bad, kid. Margaret looked like she was going to explode. She had lost, completely. The aftermath. That night, Mark made the call. Judge Carter, his brother, was not amused. She called the police because of a skateboard, he repeated, his voice flat and unamused. Yep. And she lied about a crime happening. Silence. Then a slow, deep inhale on the other end of the phone. Well. It's always interesting when people try to weaponize the law without understanding how it works. Mark could hear papers shuffling in the background. Send me the officer's name and badge number. I'll be having a word with the department about this. Mark grinned. Already on it. Liam, sitting across from him at the dinner table, perked up. Wait, does this mean Margaret's in actual trouble? Oh, you have no idea. The neighborhood's victory. By the next morning, the entire neighborhood was buzzing. Margaret's meltdown had gone viral, or at least neighborhood viral. The HOA Facebook page was flooded with clips of her screeching at the officers, demanding Liam be arrested, and then immediately panicking when she realized she had called the cops on a judge's nephew. The comment section was a goldmine. This is the same woman who fined me for having my trash can out an hour too early. So skateboarding is a crime now? Guess my 8-year-old is going to federal prison. HOA Karen, you've officially lost your mind. Please resign. And then my personal favorite. Does anyone know where we can find an HOA-sized skateboard? Asking for a friend. Margaret naturally lost it in the comments. She tried arguing with everyone, claiming it was all taken out of context, that she was just looking out for the safety of the neighborhood, that she was being unfairly targeted. No one bought it. Even worse, the HOA board noticed. That afternoon, Mark got an email summoning him to an emergency HOA meeting. The subject line, urgent concerns regarding HOA president's conduct. Mark laughed so hard, he almost choked on his coffee. The final showdown. The meeting was brutal. Margaret sat at the head of the HOA conference table, arms crossed, glaring at everyone like a dictator clinging to power. The other board members, they looked exhausted. Margaret, one of them sighed, rubbing his forehead. Do you have any idea how bad this looks? Margaret huffed. I was doing my duty as HOA president. Another board member, a woman who had clearly had enough of Margaret's nonsense, crossed her arms. By calling 911 on a kid and then lying about it? I didn't lie, Margaret snapped. I just may have exaggerated slightly. Silence. Margaret, the woman continued. We received a notice from Judge Carter's office this morning. Margaret stiffened. What kind of notice? The board member slid a piece of paper across the table. He's requested a formal review of your conduct as HOA president and has filed an official complaint about your misuse of emergency services. If this goes to court, you could face actual charges. Margaret looked like she was about to pass out. Charges, she squeaked. The board member nodded. And given the overwhelming complaints from residents about your behavior, we're putting it to a vote. Margaret's face turned ghost white. Vote? What vote? To remove you as HOA president. Margaret's jaw dropped. You can't do that. The board members exchanged glances. Actually, one of them said, flipping through the bylaws, we can. And after this disaster, I think we should. Mark sat back in his chair, arms crossed, enjoying every second of it. Liam, sitting next to him, leaned over and whispered, this is the best thing I've ever witnessed. Mark grinned. Oh, just wait. It gets better. Because Margaret was about to lose everything, and it was all her fault. The end of an era. Margaret lasted exactly 1 month before she finally cracked. The combination of public humiliation, no HOA power, and being legally cornered was too much. Her house went up for sale overnight. Rumors spread like wildfire. I heard she's moving across town to another HOA. God help them. What if she just starts another dictatorship somewhere else? Nah, her reputation is ruined. No HOA is going to let her near power again. And sure enough, within weeks, Margaret was gone. Her house sold, and she disappeared into the abyss, never to terrorize the neighborhood again. The day the moving trucks pulled away, Liam celebrated the only way he knew how, with one final, glorious kickflip in the middle of the street. Neighbors clapped and cheered. Even Officer Reynolds drove by, rolled down his window, and gave Liam a nod of approval. Nice form, kid. Liam beamed. Thanks, officer. The neighborhood was finally free. Epilogue, a new beginning. With Margaret gone, the HOA actually started functioning like a normal association again. No more ridiculous fines for nonsense. No more secret rule changes. No more dictatorship. The new HOA president, a chill old guy who mostly spent his time gardening and waving at people, had only one rule: just don't set anything on fire. Everyone laughed. Liam leaned over to Mark and grinned. Best HOA president ever. Months later, they randomly got an update on Margaret. Apparently, she tried to take over another HOA in a different neighborhood. She failed miserably. The moment her new neighbors Googled her name, they found every post, every meme, every video of her downfall. She was instantly rejected from the HOA board. From what Mark heard, she was now just another resident, stuck under someone else's rules. No power, no control, just a bitter, powerless Margaret. And honestly, Mark thought, that's the best punishment she could ever receive. Because now, whenever she sees a skateboard rolling down the street, she can't do a single thing about it. And that is justice.